Okay, Judges chapter 7. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men encamped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them, in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel will boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go, and if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water, where the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their hands, on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and the trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I'm going to give it into your hands. If you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling his friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be none other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of them all, and torches inside. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." The dangers of victory is what I've titled this. The dangers of victory. Start with when all we have is not enough. When all we have is not enough. Gideon has called an army to battle with the Midianites and all their mates. It's a huge foe that they're facing. The foe is huge. One part of the army that they were facing in chapter 8, verse 10, tells us that there were 135,000 men. And they could only muster 32,000. The Midianite army was, well, they're not just them, their camels were like a swarm of locusts. They couldn't be numbered. Never mind the men who were with the camels, and it was overwhelming odds, utterly on any level, whatever. It was utterly overwhelming. It's a kind of odds that we face as Christians today in the UK. Not everywhere in the world. There are some places in the world where you will go, and on a Sunday, it'll seem to you like everyone's going to church. There are places like that. There are places in Brazil and in Nigeria. There are places in India. There are places in places in America, which are still, when you went, you'd say there's the majority of the people in this town are going to church. I'm sure there are places in some parts of China that would be similar. But for us, we're a tiny minority. A tiny minority. I was looking up some statistics because I wasn't feeling depressed enough. So I thought I'd look up some statistics. In 2017, 6% of people in the UK said that they prayed daily. Now that, just of the people they questioned, they didn't ask, who are you praying to or what you praying? But 6% of people in the UK said in a questionnaire, a blind questionnaire, so they'd no reason to lie, 6% said they prayed daily. 8%, worryingly, of church membership. Okay, so 2% of those of church membership didn't even say they prayed daily. That was from the Faith Survey, faithsurvey.co.uk. I don't recommend you go and read it. It's pretty grim reading. And they referenced other surveys, Pew Survey. At the last election, the majority, Caerphilly, I'm trying to work out what Caerphilly was. I think Caerphilly was the first majority area in the census where people said they didn't believe there was any God at all. Okay, so over 50% said there is no God. Okay. Now, others would say there is a God, but Caerphilly was the first place in Britain where the majority said they don't believe that there's any God at all. This next census will be very interesting to see what that throws up. I can't say I'm surprised. I am surprised it's taken so long, and I'm surprised that it was Caerphilly. I'd have thought there was other places. It's a pretty dire outlook. So when we hear that a church grows, we get quite excited, and you say, well, there's a church growing. You get quite excited. Last time you heard a church growing and you got excited, how many new people had joined the church? 10? 20? If that. It's minuscule, isn't it? It's when we get excited about churches growing, it's minuscule numbers in reality. And then when you hear, you're at a church conference, so you go to a church conference and you say, well, this is fantastic. You go maybe to Aberystwyth, or you go to Word Alive, or you go to Keswick, or you go to one of those, and there's maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people in a building or in a tent. You go to a tent, go to Keswick, and there's 3,000, 4,000 in a building in a tent. You go, this is fantastic. They get 40,000 into a stadium to watch football twice a week. It's tiny amounts. When all we have is not enough. And but, like Gideon, God could change the situation. And this is not the first time that the church in Britain has been in such a bad state. And should God tarry, it won't be the last time. We've known times when the church has been in as poor a state as it is now. And you can go back to not long after the Romans left, And see, the French, the Normans actually brought a revival of religion, didn't they? Before the Normans came, it was pretty grim. And then you can think, well, there was times in Wales where it was pretty grim, and then God began to move, and then everything changed, you know. So when all we have is not enough. My second point is when the little we have is far too much. Okay, so you read the story, and it in a way, it reads like a comedy, almost like a comedy of errors. But you know it's not a comedy of errors because God is very deliberate in what he's doing. If taking a bull, a 7-year-old bull up a hill in the middle of the night was a test of faith, going to an army of 32,000 and saying, if you're scared, you can go home, is another test of faith, especially when 22,000 quit the field. What on earth was going through Gideon's mind? And then God says, you've still got far too many of the 10,000 who are left. Now remember, we're looking at 10,000 against a portion of the army that's 135,000. So then you get to 10,000, and God says, you've still got too many. I'm going to reduce it to 300. So you go down to the river, and God will say, well, I'll show you who. And then the way God chooses it seems quite random. I've heard people try and explain God's thinking in that I've heard one man saying, well, the people who got down on their knees by the river, they weren't properly watchful. It's a load of rubbish, isn't it? That's not what was going on at all. God was just thinning it out until he had 300 left. But he tells us the reason. God orchestrated this reduction, he tells us in verse 2. Because I cannot deliver Midian into your hands, for Israel or Israel would boast that they have saved themselves with their own strength against me. It's quite sad, isn't it? God knew their hearts, and he knew their hearts very well. And actually, what God understands of their hearts is worked out later on. It's seen later on in the story. It's hard to believe that Israel would boast with 32,000 people, because it's quite obvious that against such a huge army, it really was God's work. 32,000 against 100 and whatever thousand people. If there was a victory there, you'd have to say God was involved. But God says, this is how crooked human beings can be. I need to make sure that there is absolutely no way on earth that they can take any glory at all for themselves. That's quite a statement. But it's a very real danger. Now, so my question is, could that possibly be where we are? Could that be where we are as congregations? Could that be where we are as the church in the UK? And to answer those questions, you've got to really have a think about what's being done and how we think things could change, or what would be required to change things. So, for instance, if you said the only way that things will change is if the churches all get together and work together. Now, it would be nice for all the churches to work better together. I agree. But if you say that the only way it could change was if that happened, what are you trusting? You're starting to trust numbers, aren't you? Or if you say of a congregation, it'll only improve here if another 30 people arrive. Well, you're starting to trust in numbers. If you said it would be nice to have another 30, but do you understand the difference between, do you understand what I'm saying? The difference between saying it would be nice if there were more to saying we won't succeed unless there's more, there's a real difference. Because you're putting your trust in numbers, not in God. You're putting your trust in what humans can do rather than in what God can do. There's a few things have happened over the years that kind of set alarm bells off in this area. And various attempts over the years have been made to, say, for instance, get all the churches in the UK to pray at the same time. You say, it would be nice, it's nice for all the churches to pray at the same time. It's nice to know other churches are praying, but that wasn't what was behind it. What was behind it was some kind of belief that if all the churches prayed at the same time, there would be enough power or influence. I'm not even sure if it had been thought through well. Either there'd be more power or influence, or God would be more convinced. These are daft arguments, but they rise up every once in a while. There was a thing, wasn't there? Did it ever touch the area? You march through the area and claim it for Jesus and try and get as many. Did you ever do that? March, prayer marches. No, you never come across those? No? Yeah? Did you come across them? Yeah? And the idea was to get as many people as you could, because it's the numbers that would make the difference. You're almost bordering on we saved ourselves. It's almost God saves us. He may use 1, he may use 300, he may use 3,000. But God saves us. And various other attempts that we've made over the years. And you just have to be careful, don't you? You know, the Billy Graham Crusades were remarkably blessed by God, but then people tried to create a large crusade in order to get some momentum going, and it's almost like we're saving ourselves. If God saves it, it's up to God. Lots of people seeking God and giving Him the glory afterwards, and that's what you see here. God says, even 10,000 is too many, because if they win the battle, they'll say, we did it. I'm going to make sure that no one can boast in front of me. I wonder if God was saying that again. I'm going to make sure no one can boast in front of me. I'm going to do a work in such a way that only I will receive the glory. And we have to look at our own hearts at this point then, don't we? And does that make sense to you, what's happening? Yeah? Do you understand? Can you think of ways in which this comes out, where we think we're saving ourselves?
I can tell you the way that God proved it, because Billy Graham was supposed to come to Swansea. And I was a counsellor at that, and you had months and months of preparation, which in order to be a counsellor you had to attend these meetings where they taught you how to deal with people and everything. But we were all so focused now that Billy Graham was coming to Swansea. And what happened? He had flu and he couldn't come to Swansea, and his brother-in-law came. And they reckon as many people came to the Lord when his brother-in-law preached.
See, there's a lesson, isn't there?
And so all the people that had put their trust in Billy Graham, they had to realise
it was God.
People didn't trust in God.
Yeah. Part of that was the danger of counting numbers. Who had made a decision afterwards.
No,
that
I don't
becomes
think
no,
that was
but
part of it. The reason why we had all these meetings beforehand was to instruct us in what were good churches, because Billy Graham was very concerned that they weren't just saved and left on their own, that we would introduce them to churches near where they lived, that they could very, very well organised. But what I'm saying is lots of people were saying,
We're trusting in
Billy
him.
Graham's coming
Yeah.
to Swansea,
Yeah.
and one Billy Graham at all,
No.
but the Lord still worked
Yeah.
without Billy Graham.
And then the other danger is it was because we organised, a big thing was organised that people were saved. No, it's, do you know, God saved a lot of people through that man. And remarkably, and as far as I can see, he remained of that opinion. He remained humble. Others have had their heads turned, you know, and I think, yeah. But then you wonder, you know, we're reduced to a small group. Is this so that God would be glorified when he blesses? You know, here in the UK, if the church was to turn around, at no point really could we say, certainly in Wales, we couldn't say that we'd done it, or we had, you know, he's brought us to that point. Our only hope is God to move. You know, we can't stir it up. Our only hope is that God moves. And when he does move, then we have to make sure that he has the glory. I also think that it's not illustrated here, but I think it's a biblical principle that, well, maybe it is illustrated here with Gideon. He takes a small step and God blesses that, and then he takes another step and God blesses that, and now he's going to take a very large step. And God could trust him at this point with his response on the first few occasions. And I think when God blesses us in small ways, we get an idea of whether we can cope with greater blessing without blowing our own trumpet. I was concerned this couple of weeks ago. I was listening to someone and they were saying how wonderfully their church had been blessed and how big it was, and telling all the people they were doing a wonderful job, and that I understood that, but I thought, I've not heard you thank God, and it's God that's changing lives, not you. But that was just an aside. Yeah. Thirdly, then, all we have is God. When all we have is God. So when the numbers we have is not enough, but in fact it's too much, okay? And then when all we have is God. So there's Gideon. What would you do? He's reduced it to 300. God's reduced it to 300. Everyone else has gone home. What on earth do you do there? God realizes that there's a problem here, or that there's not a problem. He needs to encourage Gideon. And so he says to Gideon, get up and go down to the camp. I'm going to give it into your hands. If you're afraid to attack, because he knows what's going on in Gideon's mind, verse 10, it would be what's going on in my mind with 300 men against 100 and something thousand. If you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant, Purah. So God wants a witness. So it's not just Gideon. There's two of them. And when they come back, two of them will give testimony, not just Gideon, you know. So the camp lay below him in the valley. And so in the night, they went down to the camp. And they hear this very strange dream. Two guards, it seems, are talking. And as they arrive, they can hear these two lookouts talking, because it's the middle of the night, right? So the people have gone home in the daytime. It's come to dusk. It's the middle of the night. God says, go down, see what's going on. And what's going to happen is they're going to hear, they're going to go back, they're going to spread around, and before dawn, they're going to launch their attack. So that's the timing. So this will be the early watch of the evening then, I would guess. And they go down and they're listening in at a tent. They're earwigging. And one man's telling his friend, I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force, the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend, who was a proper Job's comforter, isn't he? He says, this can be none other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. What you realize is that while the Midianite camp was huge, there were people there who were properly frightened. They were properly frightened. And they had no reason to be. Because for years they'd been doing this. For years they'd been going up into Israel. For years they'd been stripping the land. For years they'd been dominating. They had no reason to be frightened. They had pinned down Israel for a decade. Over a decade they'd pinned down Israel. And something's happening. God is at work in the minds and the hearts of these men who should be so confident. That's what Gideon sees, isn't it? Not bravado, not confidence, not arrogance, which is what you would expect, not glee. What he finds are men who are scared. You know, they're an obscure dream, because this is obscure, isn't it? I mean, this is if you look at the dream, there's a roll of a loaf of bread coming down the hill and striking the camp, and this man's so petrified. He goes, "It's obviously Gideon." How is it obviously Gideon? I don't understand how it's obviously Gideon. What's the connection between the loaf of bread and a little man in a defeated country? God's at work. That's Gideon's conclusion, isn't it? God's at work. What could I draw from this? I think, first of all, what you'd say is people are not always as confident as they look. They're not always as confident as you would expect them to be, or at times as they would seem to be. And the most confident people in the most secure positions can become deeply disturbed. They can become very frightened, even though to all intents and purposes their position is very strong. That's an encouragement, because we're a tiny minority in a very large and what we would consider to be a very aggressive, would maybe use the word secular society. And we would say everyone looks so confident, everyone's trusting in science, no one believes in God, everyone seems to have a clear aim on what they want to get out of their lives, and maybe our neighbours and our friends, they come across as so confident and so capable, and you think, how could this ever change? Well, God could change just in a moment. And so here are these men. I don't think they felt like this when they set off. I'm sure they wouldn't have set off if they were scared. And here they are in the ascendancy, but scared. They're scaring themselves at the night watch. And they say, well, this is... And you don't know what God is doing in people's lives and in their hearts. They come over all confident and all strong, and you think, do you know, they are. What is there that I could say? But actually, if God is at work, they may be concerned, worried, frightened, uncertain. Uncertain. People whose sheer arrogance, they say, well, I don't believe there's a God, or I don't believe there's such a place as heaven or such a place as hell. It's often a great bravado, because we're told that God has placed eternity in our hearts. We know that there's more than this life. And Sometimes God gives us a little glimpse, but sometimes someone becomes a Christian. And you think, how on earth could they become a Christian? Think of Paul going to Tarsus. And you think he was so strong, so clear, so arrogant. And in a moment, Christ meets him and his whole world has fallen apart. And everyone looks and says, it was lightning. But God's met him and everything changes. And here are these men and God's changing there. It's going to work out in a most awful way for them, because it's not just two men. What we're going to find out is it's over 100,000 men are of this position, because once they start blowing their trumpets, bedlam, it's proper bedlam, and everyone jumps up and they start attacking each other. But we're reminded by Zechariah's words came to my mind. Zechariah 4:6. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. And that's an encouragement, isn't it? God can go before us. God can prepare the way. God can defeat the enemy. God can save. God can save us. He can save others. He can save us from others. He can save others from themselves. And when all we have is God, we just have to make sure at the end of it that we give him the glory. I think that's the key thing with Gideon. We'll find out if he does it in the future. Let me just pause this.